Welcome to the Town Pension and Oversight Committee meeting of June 4th, 2019. Can I get a roll call?
Thank you and good evening. Councilmember Syock. Here. Councilmember Spector.
Here.
Councilmember Rennie.
Here.
Vice Mayor Jensen.
Here.
Mayor and Chair Leonardis.
Here. So we will begin. Mr. Andrews.
Thank you, Mayor and Town Council. This evening's agenda is primarily administrative items to ensure that this committee oversees the quarterly performance of the two IRS 115 pension trusts.
Excuse me, Mayor. Verbal communications and consent item.
Thank you very much. All right. So we have one card for verbal and one for our agenda item. So on the verbal communications we have, should I do consent first? Vice Mayor.
Move approval of the consent calendar, which consists of 5 minutes from last meeting.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed, none. Moving on to verbal communications. Terry Derriere, sorry. Freudian slip.
I'm going to put something on. Honorable Committee Chair and committee members, I speak as a non-voting member of the Town Council Finance Committee, whose voting members recommended that the town invest the 115 pension monies in PAR's Capital Appreciation Index Fund. This is the most aggressive asset mix of the three alternatives PAR's offers. The reasoning was that over the long run, the Index Plus Fund would achieve higher returns. But because of the fund's asset allocations, the returns are expected to have higher or greater volatility. And the hope is that the returns will be higher in the strong stock markets, while accepting the losses will be expected to be greater in a declining market. As of April 2019, the Index Plus Fund had asset value of $4.4 million, with another $4 million identified to be invested, that would bring the total to $8.8 million, or over $8 million. When the Oversight Committee was first established, Mr. Andrews had an attorney present a workshop to you on your fiduciary responsibility as committee members. In my opinion, the most important role this Oversight Committee can fill is to assess the risk of each of the town's investment funds, both the 115 pension funds and CalPERS OPEB funds. Now that you recognize and appreciate your fiduciary responsibility, I ask that you get additional training in how to fulfill this responsibility most effectively by understanding the investment risks in the context of the town's finances. With the training, you'll have a better understanding of these consequences behind your decisions to pursue a strategy of higher returns, but at higher risks. The Oversight Committee is the town's equivalent of CalPERS Governing Fund. Just last month, May, the CalPERS Board had an education workshop on investment risk and basic returns. The training said it was developed as a primer for CalPERS investment trustees. I'm asking you to request a similar education system. Here is one slide of the 55 in the presentation that I hope will stimulate your interest. If you look at the reflections, it speaks to some of the issues that should be addressed. With this in mind, I'll finish with two quotes from the workshop. It stated, "A trustee does not necessarily need extensive investment experience to do the job well." And I'll close with a quote from Benjamin Graham, Warren Buffett's mentor.
Mr.
The essence of investment management.
Your time is up.
Okay, thank you.
Do we have any questions for the speaker? Mr. Rennie?
I didn't quite hear the last quote. Could you give it to me again, please?
Thank you. Yes, this is from Benjamin Graham, Warren Buffett's mentor. The essence of investment management entails the management of risk, not the management of returns. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Any more speakers? We have a question? Vice Mayor?
It's actually a question for Mr. Andrews or Ms. Privetti, not for Mr. Duryea, but it's related to his comments. Would you remind me of what limitations the town has and we have as the OPEB board for risk management and the kinds of investments that we can make?
Thank you for the question. So in relation to OPEB, that asset allocation is actually run through CalPERS. CalPERS offers a 115 trust vehicle. This board is currently invested in what's referred to as the CERBT1 strategy. That strategy is the highest equity allocation of the three. CalPERS does offer two other asset allocations that, for the most part, when we talk about risk, we're talking about equity exposure, and so each one of them will have slightly less equity exposures, and with that will come slightly less volatility, and volatility is a way of just talking about risk.
And we are now at the highest risk for our equity?
Correct. The CERBT Trust Strategy 1 was the first strategy that this council went into back in 2009 when you first created the trust. Since then, we've had one of the more exceptional bull markets in our nation's history for the last 10 years, and so it served the purpose well, but staff has previously suggested perhaps reevaluating the risk associated with that asset allocation.
Okay, thank you.
We'll go with Councilmember Sayoc.
Mr. Andrews, so how often is that risk that we chose analyzed, and is it something that fluctuates depending on how the market is doing, or is it once you made a decision you're stuck with that?
So if you think about risk and volatility in kind of a simple sense, think of it in terms of amplitude. You know, the higher the volatility, the more amplitude you're exposed to, which means if the market goes down, you're going to probably track the market pretty closely. If the market goes up, you're probably going to track it pretty closely. As you move into less risky strategies, usually what they do is they move assets out of equity products, whether it's private equity or listed equity, and then they usually move it into probably fixed income. Fixed income tends to have a lower risk exposure profile, and that's how they lower the volatility. This body recently, I want to say probably about 2 meetings ago, kind of looked at the risk of that again. I will say since then there have been additional conversations, you know, as we talk about whether there's going to be additional pension assets to invest and kind of reevaluating risk. At the June 17th Finance Committee meeting, based on some guidance from the Town Council, we intend to kind of restart that conversation at the Finance Committee, look at, you know, whether additional monies, what the effect would be if you put it into the OPEB 115 trust, additional monies if you put it into the pension 115 trust, and additional monies if you were to keep investing in PARs with a long-term objective.
Councilmember Spector.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. You may have answered my question. In the next Finance Committee meeting, we'd be looking at the 115, but we would also be looking at direct, this is my wording, direct payments to CalPERS?
Correct. During the budget discussions, the Town Council made it fairly clear that they would like to understand better how additional monies can be utilized. You know, currently the strategy has been for additional monies to be put in the Pension 115 Trust. As the Speaker identified, as of April, that's now about $4.4 million. This council has also identified another 3.2 during the budget process, and so we are starting to talk about assets, you know, in the vicinity of about $8 million. And so we will restart that conversation at the Finance Committee, and whatever recommendations come out of the Finance Committee, we'd probably bring back both to the Town Council and to this body.
Thank you.
All right, no more questions. That's the last card I have for verbal communication. We'll move on to our other business. Agenda item number 2, accept the performance report and fund balance for the California Employees Retirement Benefit Trust for the period ending March 31st, 2019.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As we were just discussing, the town has what's referred to as our OPEB trust. This trust actually houses all of the assets related to the town's healthcare program. For the month end, for the quarter end, March 31st, 2019, there is approximately $16.7 million in assets in the trust, and for the quarter, it returned about 10.1% gross of fees for the quarter. As I mentioned, these are really administrative items. The council has an investment policy that says you should be reviewing your quarterly performance every quarter. And so for the quarter of March 31st, at least for the OPEB trust, that's the return and the assets for that trust.
Thank you. Questions for staff? Seeing none, we'll go on to verbal communications. Terry Derrier.
Thank you again. I have some specific comments on the 115 Plan Trust that are in some cases supplementary to the comments that we've already had, the comments that Mr. Andrews made. I've heard that only 10% of the PARS clients have chosen to put money in the PARS Capital Appreciation Index Plus Fund, which is the riskiest. I'm asking you to revisit, it sounds like it's on the Finance Committee agenda, that decision to invest in the Index Plus Fund. And this is a good time to revisit it, and for the following two reasons. The economy has been expanding for more than 120 months. This is the longest period of expansion since 1945. And that's the earliest date I could get information from on Wikipedia. But more importantly, we now have an inverted yield curve. So what's an inverted yield curve? I don't have the time to explain it, but I would say that it's recognized as a highly respected predictor of the future economy. Since 1956, the economy has fallen into a recession within 7 to 24 months after the start of every inversion, according to Investopedia. Personally, I see some value in putting money into a 115 plan. I won't necessarily argue for it, but I see some value. But I believe this committee needs to recognize that the time when the money will be most wanted, is during an economic downturn, which is exactly when the 115 plan assets will be most at risk for declines in value. That's why I'm asking the committee to revisit the decision of what PARS funds it wants. In summary, earlier I asked the committee to get some additional education consistent with what PARS is providing its trustees. Secondly, I'm asking the committee to revisit the asset allocation for PARS.
Thank you. Questions? Councilmember Sack?
Based on what Assistant Town Manager Andrews had shared, that this will be looked at the Finance Committee, is there any other information that you feel would be useful to help in that analysis?
I have no idea. I did not even know this was on the agenda. I have not had access to the agenda. I don't know what the material will be, but once I see it, if there's additional information, I will request that we get it.
Thank you.
Councilmember Rennie?
Thank you. Mr. Duryea, you said the time that we're most likely to want help from the 115 fund is during economic downturn. That is probably a good time. But another time would be if you look at our forecasted unfunded payments. They peak in about, say, 8 years from now at maybe I'm going to try to remember, 3 to 4 million more per year than they are now. So another time might be irrelevant, irregards of the economy, but when these are peaking out at, say, somewhere between 8 and 12 years from now. Do you think that's also a good time to use the 115 funds?
Absolutely. That was the role in which it was devised originally. I didn't think I had the time to address that, but if it's 8 years from now, that investment horizon is short enough that we may not have the time frame to have our investment pool recover. So even if that's the intent, it would still make sense to revisit the asset allocation, because it's possible we'll want those funds in a shorter time period. than we might otherwise plan.
And that might be a good thing to discuss at your committee. I know you don't control the agenda, but and I don't. I'm just trying to remember. It may not be 8 years, maybe 10 years, or, and so forth. So it might be something to discuss in your committee.
I'm very familiar with the topic, and I think it's closer to 8 than 12.
Okay.
It might not peak in 8, but you want to start drawing at 8.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Moving back to council for discussions and or motion. Vice Mayor.
Move that we accept the performance report and fund balance for the California Employees Retirement Benefit Trust for the period ending March 31st.
Councilmember Sayoc.
I'll second the motion, and I appreciate how a council member asked the Finance Committee to look into some issues. And I know for the Finance Committee on the agenda is the discussion of our 115. I like the idea of looking at the intent. I know one of the things we talked about at our last budget was when do we actually utilize those funds? And so if that could be clarified when that comes back to council, that would be great too.
Motion and a second. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? None. Passes unanimously. Moving on to item number 3. Accept the quarterly performance report for the period ending March 31st and account summary for statements for the town of Los Gatos, Section 115 through April 2019.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Similar to the previous item, this is the quarterly report for the PARS 115 Trust, which houses additional discretionary payments that have been put into the 115 Trust. For the period ended March 31st, 2019, there was approximately $4 million in assets. You also have an updated April statement that shows those assets are now approximately $4.4 million. And for the March 31st, 2019 quarterly period, the PARS account returned approximately 9.9% for the quarter.
Thank you. Questions of staff? Seeing none, I don't have any cards on this item, so we'll move back to council. Vice Mayor?
Move that we accept the quarterly performance report for the IRS Section 115 Pension Trust through the period of March 31st.
Second.
Motion and a second. Discussion? Seeing none. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? None. It passes unanimously. We will adjourn to our regular session at 7 p.m. Thank you.